Well, now that we've seen the basics of holding, let's take a look at what happens when we are facing real winds. Winds have a very major impact on holding. After all, the pattern is only 1 minute long, and so distortions are very easily caused by winds, and they can throw you off quite a lot. Your GPS and ground track readouts can be very helpful in determining what the wind is doing to you, but I find that students tend to not pay attention to this important information. Let's look at two specific cases where winds have a major impact. In the first case, imagine that we have a strong tailwind on the inbound leg of the holding course. In that case, as we make our turn to the outbound leg, we'll have a rather slow ground speed. And if we wait for 1 minute and start our turn inbound, we may easily find ourselves in a position where we're intercepting the inbound course very close to the station. This can be a very difficult interception to make, and we often have a problem with that. And so we really need to recognize that we have a headwind on the outbound leg and a tailwind on the downwind leg, and we need to make an adjustment for that. The second case is fairly interesting. In this case, we have a strong crosswind. The first thing I want you to notice is that the holding pattern is not depicted as a nice racetrack pattern as we're used to seeing in the textbooks. Here we have sort of, I don't know what to call it, an egg shape, an oval, it's distorted. I don't know what to call it. And the reason for that is that during our turn to the outbound leg, that's the top half of the turn, we have a very high ground speed due to the tailwind. That gives us a long radius of turn. And conversely, when we're going to make our turn inbound, we have a very short radius of turn. And so we really need to make an aggressive correction in order to compensate for these two factors. Otherwise, we've got to do some octafugling or some gymnastics in order to get back on the inbound course. So the rule of thumb is that if we observe a, let's say, 10-degree heading correction on the inbound leg, that we would triple that on the outbound leg. So if we see 10 degrees on the inbound leg, we want to have a 30-degree correction on the outbound leg. And the reason for that is that the holding pattern consists of 4 1-minute segments. That's the 1 minute inbound, the 1 minute turn, the 1 minute outbound, the 1 minute turn back to the inbound course, and so forth. And so we have guidance on one section, but no guidance on the other 3. The turn we can't do much about. We're going to do standard rate turns. And so the only choice we have is to wrap up all of those corrections in our outbound leg course correction. And so we need to make a course correction that is 3 times larger than our inbound course correction on the outbound leg. And that'll allow us to make a nice smooth intercept back to the inbound leg. If we fail to consider this, we're going to have some very difficult intercepts to do. We'll undershoot the inbound course, and we'll have to work with that. As we finish our discussion on holding in winds, it's a good time to bring up the subject of intercepting the inbound course. That's the leg where you're going into the fix, and it is the only leg during the holding where you actually have guidance. So a couple of things I wanted to point out about making that intercept that help. The first one is a sort of a rough rule of thumb. This applies many times. It doesn't always work, but under typical conditions, I ask my students to look down and observe the inbound heading passing through the 90-degree index mark on their DG. At that point, again, with a lot of caveats, you should start to see needle movement. And so the picture you're looking at right here, we're about to approach this 90-degree point. We've got another 20 degrees to go to a heading of north in a standard rate turn. And so if I were flying this, I would be looking to see the needle starting to quiver and starting to move. If it doesn't do that, you need to either slow your turn down or even stop your turn under some cases. And conversely, if you look up and you see the needle moving already and you're not quite at the 90-degree point, you might want to speed up the turn, or at the very minimum, expect that you're going to overshoot the inbound course and have to make some adjustments. Well, I'd like to say a few words about using the HSI for making your final intercept. HSI is a wonderful device. It really helps your situational awareness, but there are a couple of things about using an HSI that are a little different. And
really it's beyond the scope of this video to go into that in much detail. But I just wanted to point out one of the more simple rules that we apply when we're using an HSI, and that is to line up the lubber line with the top of the course deviation indicator, the CDI. So you see in the picture here, the white mark there on the top of the indicator is the lubber line. And if you were to imagine the top of the CDI needle lining up with the lubber line, we'd probably want to be on a heading of 020. Now, under most conditions, that sort of thing works quite well. And as you can imagine, as you get closer and closer to making the intercept, you get less and less of a cut. And it works pretty well. But you do have to be careful about blindly applying this. Sometimes winds can kind of throw everything off. But at least it gives you a starting point. Well, in closing, I'd like to finish with one last topic, and that is what happens when things really go wrong, botched entries. And it's going to happen. Winds and any number of things can cause you to be completely out of whack. And so what I recommend to people is that if you find yourself in trouble on a hold, fly directly to the fix, try to cross the fix on the inbound heading to the maximum extent possible. And that should allow you to set up for a subsequent hold and you're back in business. So now to wrap things up, I just want to summarize everything with just a few points that I think you need to commit to memory. They're on this chart. And the number one thing that you need to memorize, burn it into your memory. It needs to be like your own name, and that is the 5 T's. As I've said several times in this video, an awful lot of mistakes are directly related to the fact that people skip one of the 5 T's during a critical point in the procedure. So then we have 5 things that I'd like you to try to remember. Number 1 is in right-hand holds, the CDI will be deflected to the left or centered when you're on the holding side, and conversely on the non-holding side. A from indication is always present when you're on the top half of the pattern. So keep those things in mind and you'll be able to orient yourself relative to the holding pattern. Holding entries can be summarized in a few things. Your first priority is to determine your inbound and outbound course. And again, I've said this before, it's very, very important to do that. That's a critical step. And if you're kind of going into the holding pattern against the pattern, that is in the opposite direction of holding, then you're going to be doing a teardrop or parallel. And the best way to know which one of those you're going to do is to ask yourself, what's the shortest direction to turn to the outbound leg? If it's the same, it's a teardrop. If it's not the same, you're in a parallel situation. And remember that parallel entries always involve 2 turns in the opposite direction of holding. To find the outbound leg in a teardrop pattern, in standard, that is right-hand turn patterns, subtract 30 degrees from the normal outbound course. Wind corrections are always 3 times the amount of the inbound course correction. And so you have to be fairly aggressive on making a heading change during your outbound leg if you know you're dealing with a lot of crosswind. And finally, get in the habit of watching the index marks on your DG. That's true in many situations. It really helps your orientation. And specifically in the case of holding, we like to see needle movement when we're about 90 degrees to go to the inbound heading. So finally, I hope that you've been able to get something out of this course. I hope it's been helpful. I know it's been a bit long. I tried to cover this subject in quite a lot of detail. Try to cover all the bases. And hopefully this will help you in your pursuit for your instrument rating.